So in this presentation, we're going to tackle some of the most important elements in our game. And I'll just hit the play button to evaluate where I'm at. And currently I have my player object in the center of the screen, and every time I push and hold my space bar, I see that my object is floating up and down. Now eventually my object's going to kind of tumble around, and maybe that's something I want, I like or I don't like. But for now, the basic element of moving up and down seems like it's working pretty well. Now, if I go back and reference my basic wireframe for the gameplay calls for the object to move up and down, and for some basic elements to be spawned inside the environment and have those move towards the player. We'll avoid the obstacles while trying to collect some of the other things. So that calls for a couple of things. First of all, I want to frame my player so that it's a little bit closer to the left side of the camera. I also want to incorporate some basic obstacles that move by themselves towards the player. And so I'll jump back into Unity. Now the first thing that I noticed that's going to be a little bit of an issue is that my camera is just framed in the center it's framing my player in the center of the screen. That's not exactly what I want. So in my scene view, I'll just drag my camera over just a bit, and you can see that when I move that over, I'm getting a really exaggerated perspective, which is fine. But more importantly, I'm running out of ground over here. So I want to make sure that my ground is a little bit longer. So I'll just grab my ground object here and I'll bump this out to say 50. So I'm no longer running into the issue of seeing the edge of my ground, and I'll hit the play button and evaluate what's going on here. So my player is off to the left. There are some things that I could do to kind of still keep it in a 3D perspective without such an exaggerated perspective, but for now I think that's okay. The other issue that I think that I'm going to run into is I'm not thrilled about the constant thrust at this point. I think I want to be able to tap the space bar maybe, or if I click and hold. The major malfunction that we have is what we're seeing now is that our object is drifting in our Z space. So I don't really have an issue at this point with it moving left or right or up or down, but I definitely don't want it moving back into the Z space. So if I just tilt my perspective here, you can see our Z axis is running into the background. And what I can do, very simply, I can grab my player object and look at it in the inspector and find the rigid body component. And when I find the constraint menu, if I click on a little triangle next to it, what I can do is freeze the position of Z. So in other words, I'm restricting its Z motion, so this object will no longer drift back and forth in the Z, effectively limiting its movement to the Y and the X. Okay, so even though I'm working in a 3D space, I'm restricting its motion to the X and Y. And so I still have this mechanic where I'm pressing the thrust. And I kind of have mixed feelings about the thrust mechanic, but I can always go back and tweak that later. What's most important now is to start establishing some basic obstacles. And so in order to do this, what I'll do is I'll just get started with another game object. I'll create a cube, and the cube that I'm going to create, I'll just move this kind of off to the right side. It's going to be a little bit bigger, so I'm going to bump its scale in all directions up to 2, and in fact maybe I'll bump the Y value up to maybe 4 or maybe 3. I'll leave it at 4 for now. And I'll just kind of move this in a place that it makes sense that it's kind of sitting on top of my ground plane. As this moves in space, I'll probably move it just up in the Z space a little bit, so it's right in the middle of the ground. And I'll look over here at the position coordinates, and I'll just round off some of these values here. So it's 2 along the Y. And it looks like it's 0 is the most appropriate point along the Z. So I have my first obstacle, it's in space. Now, what I want to do is I want this object to move in the direction of X. Okay, so if I take this object and I grab it by its X axis and I'm changing its position left and right, you'll notice that as I drag this object to the left of the scene, so in other words, I'm moving it towards my player object, you'll notice that the X position gets smaller over time. So as I drag this back, it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Okay, so we're moving in the negative X according to the position. So what I'll do is I'll create a simple state machine that handles the basic motion for this object. So with the object selected, it's currently called cube. I'll update that and I'll call it obstacle until I determine a better name for it. I'll right click and add an FSM. Now state 1, the job of this state is simply to move the object. So I'll call it moving, or I could just simply call it move. And what I want to do is I want to look for a translate or a transform. I'm looking inside transform, I'm looking for a translate. So transform translate, I'll double click to add that translate to my moving state. Now a translate command will cause the position to change over time. And so what I want to do is I want to use the use owner game object. I don't want to apply the direction based on a vector. I want to move it along its y axis. So there's the y field. Whenever there's a drop down menu that's referring to a, in this case, a float variable. We'll get into variables a little bit later, but for now what I want to do is I want to hardwire a value into this. So I'll click this little toggle button that changes the drop down menu to a number, and if I put in a negative value, I'll just try -5. I have no idea how fast that's going to move this object. It'll send it along its -z over time, and it's going to do this in the space of self, or I could change it to world space, and again that previous definition applies to this object as well. In this case it doesn't really matter. I don't expect this object will be twisting and turning at all, so the Z space and the world space should function just the same way. I'm going to move it per second, and I want to do it every frame. So I don't want to just move it one time and then stop. I want to do it every time a frame is redrawn on the screen. So if I'm playing my game and my game is refreshing at 60 frames per second, I can anticipate this moving in the -y X amount of times, or X distance per every frame that it updates per second. So I'm going to try -5, see how that works. And just with, a simple few clicks of the mouse, with a translate function, I have this object that's moving towards me. Now I got a little bit of a glitch. You can see that it just passes straight through my object, and I believe that when I wake this object up and add a little bit of thrust, that object will be active and it gets kind of wiped off the screen. Okay, so I have this basic object that's moving in space. It's moving a little fast for my taste. I don't think I can control my object, at least on level 1 of my game. I definitely don't want this moving so fast. So I'll take that value of translate X down to -2 and hit the play button, and let's see what I got here. So I have an object that's slowly moving. I have to get up and out of its way, and I can just hover up here, and then I'll just let it drop back down. Okay, currently this object is moving. That's what I want it to do, but it's not really affecting me in any negative way other than knocking me off the screen. So it's not, it might push me out of the way, which is kind of fun. But I'll layer some more gameplay into the equation. Now that this object is doing what it's supposed to do, it's basically simply just moving in a direction. What I want to do is I want to be able to create various objects. I want to spawn multiple versions of this object in kind of a random space. So the first object that gets generated, I might not have a lot of control over this, but it's being created at the Y position of 2. Okay, and in fact, if I were to move this down to 1, let me just key in this value. This object would start in this condition, and that could be a pretty compelling part of gameplay too. So we have this object starting down low, and I can hover right above it. But what I want to do is I want to start spawning multiple objects. And so what I'll do is I'll create a simple state machine. Its job is to do nothing but keep spitting these objects out every second or two. Okay, and the way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to need a game object. So I'll create game object, and I'll create, it doesn't really matter what shape that I create because this is just going to be kind of a placeholder. I'm going to create a sphere, and this sphere is going to be my obstacle spawner. Okay, I can name this whatever I want, but its job is to do nothing but create obstacles. Now what I'll do is I'll move this object off to the side, and what I can do is use its basic starting position. So wherever this thing exists in space, and I'll just round out these values. So it's on the X15. I mean, you don't have to copy the exact same values that I have here, but I just like to round off my values. So it's placed over here in the X, and I'll move it over just a little bit. I don't want it so far, at least at the testing phase. It's at the off to the right side. It's got a Y value of say 5 for now. Its job is going to do nothing but create objects. And so what we'll do is, with this obstacle spawner selected, I'm going to right click and I'm going to create a state machine. Now it's going to sit in this idle state and create an object. What we can do is go to game object. We can create objects, and I'll click and drag or double click and add that to state 1. Now it's important to talk about the kinds of objects that we can create. Now with this object right now, it's going to spawn objects. Whatever object we define in this game object field, this object will create based on the state machine. So it's really easy just to get this machine set up. What we can do is I'm going to make a mistake here, or at least I'm going to test this, but I'll have to change this later. What I'm going to do is take my obstacle. Right, this is just a reminder, that's the cube here. I'm going to take this obstacle and I'm going to drag and drop it into that field that says game object. So the obstacle is the thing that's being created. The point at which I want to create, I can use the sphere's position as the spawn point. So I'll go find my obstacle spawner. Remember, this thing is my sphere. I'll click and drag and drop that into the spawn point. So I'm spawning obstacles at the position of my obstacle spawner, my sphere. I'm going to ignore the position. I'll handle that later. I want it to have no rotation, and I don't really want to store the object that I'm creating. So right now, if I hit the play button, I should end up with 2 objects. Okay, I have the original object that I have, and then you can see that it spawned a duplicate. Now, because those cubes, those obstacles, have a state machine on it that's moving, when this object is spawned, when it's duplicated with this state machine on it. So now there's a little bit of a glitch here. And primarily glitch is that I typically, unless I have a very compelling reason for gameplay, I normally don't want to spawn or create an object based on something that's already inside the hierarchy. The preference is to create what's called a prefab object. And what that is that's an object that exists inside our asset folder that can be pulled out and used in the scene as needed. And the way that you create a prefab is basically what I've done here is I've created an object. I've assigned all the parameters that I want for this object. So I've defined its size, its shape. I've attached a state machine to the object. And then once I'm happy with that object and I want to use it as a prefab, what I'll do is I'll create a prefab folder. So I'll hit right click, I'll choose create, and I'll choose folder. Now I've already created a prefab folder, so I won't go through the process of naming this. And so let me just delete this new untitled folder. I'll say okay. And you can see that I have a prefabs folder. I'll double click, and inside my prefab, what I'll do, my prefabs folder, is I'll just drag whatever object I want to turn into a prefab, I'll just drag it into that folder. The act of dragging this obstacle out into the asset folder converts it to a prefab object. So now what we can do is that we can spawn objects not from an object that already exists in the hierarchy, but we can spawn objects from our asset folder, which is really valuable. And there's a number of reasons that we'll want to do that, because down the road we're going to want to destroy these objects dynamically, and if we destroy the object that we're spawning from, we won't have a reference object to build from. So we'll turn this into a prefab. Now I'm going to go back and revisit my obstacle spawner here. So rather than spawning the game object that exists here in the hierarchy, I'm going to select that obstacle and I'm going to delete it. I'm going to select my obstacle spawner, which has the spawn object here, and I'm going to drag that new prefab object into this as the game object which is being created. So in other words, this spawner is pulling this model out from my prefabs folder and going to generate it dynamically on the screen. Because I've deleted the original, the reference object, when I hit the play button, I should only have one obstacle on screen. And there it is. That's my one obstacle. Okay, so I'll wait for it to pass by. And now I can go do whatever it is that I'm doing. Okay, so I have my basic obstacle moving through the scene. Now, that was kind of fun, but not really, because all I have to do is stay in place. It has a fixed position. And by the way, this obstacle spawner, remember, the position of this object is the place where that obstacle is being spawned. So if I were to move this up and hit the play button, remember that that object's going to spawn higher. Okay, so it's using the position of the spawner as the location with which to spawn this obstacle. So what I really want to do is I don't want to spawn just one object. I want to spawn a series of objects. And I don't know how frequently I want to spawn this object, but maybe like one every second. Okay, so what I can do is I'm going to go back to my object spawn. I'm going to go into the state machine that I've created. And rather than calling this state 1, I'm going to call this spawn object or spawn obstacle. Okay, so this is where the object is created. Now what I want to do is when this is done doing what it's supposed to do, I want to pass it to another state. Okay, and the state is going to be awaiting. It's simply just going to be a let time pass for X amount of seconds before it goes back and resets and spawns another object. Okay, so I created a waiting state, and if I look through here through the actions browser, what I can do is look for a time category. And inside the time category, there's this wait action. And if I double click, it simply waits this amount of seconds, whatever's in the time field, and then executes this finish event. Now, because we have a finish event, I want it to wait to calculate this time before it fires off a finishing event. So I'll create an event for it, and I'll call this either restart or reset, whatever you want to name this. I'll go back to my state, and when we're done waiting 1 second, I'll choose restart. So I have to add that in as a transition, and I'll send that back to the spawn object. Now, we have an error in our logic. We spawn an object. When we're done spawning our object, we want to pass it over to the wait so that it waits 1 second and then comes back over and spawns the object again. Again, maybe 1 second is going to be too tight. I don't know, we'll figure that out later. But I can use the add transition finished. I can use the finish transition here so that when it spawns the object, there's no call for an action in here. Okay, so I can use the finished action to send this out. So it'll spawn an object. When it's finished spawning, it'll send it over to wait. It'll wait 1 second and then fire off this finish event, which will pass, we have it passing it back to the spawn object. So we created this loop that says, okay, spawn an object, wait a second, and then do it again. So here we go. I'll hit the play button, and we have one object, two objects. So obviously 1 second is way too frequent. So I'm going to go back to the wait state, and I'll just type in the value of 3. I'll hit the play button, and I'll test this, and we'll test this. Now that also feels a little too frequent. I don't think that I can move up and down based on the rate of speed that this is passing by. I don't feel like I can navigate through here based on these 3 second intervals. Now from a testing standpoint, 3 seconds might be good, because once we start adding randomness to the position that it spawns, we might want to be able to evaluate that pretty quickly. But for the sake of our gameplay, I'm going to set this to 4 seconds. Now one other thing that's kind of interesting is that when I play this and I test it, if I determine that this object has too much X scale, so it's too wide, and I want this to be a more narrow object, all I have to do is go into the obstacle prefab, okay? And if I just pull that object onto my scene, I can go in and modify this object. So I'll go to X, and I'll take that value down and hit return. Okay, now what I'll do is I'll get rid of my prefab object, and I'll drag this new obstacle in. Okay, so there's a number of ways that I can control that. Alternatively, if I don't need this visual reference, the easiest way to modify this, I'll just select my obstacle. This is giving me the parameters of my obstacle, so I'll just key down the value of X down to 1, hit return, and now this object should be much thinner. And I can see the preview down here, it is. So I'll hit the play button and I'll spawn these multiple objects, and everything is working just the way that it should. I'm getting a spawned object every 4 or 5 seconds. And in the next presentation, what I'll do is we'll add some random positioning to the Y here, so that maybe one object spawns down here down low, another one spawns up here high, and everywhere in between. But we'll do that in the next presentation.